Hello, everyone, and welcome to my Chapter 14 presentation. I believe this is one of the final presentations of the course, so hopefully I do well, and yeah, let's get it going. So most of the chapters so far have had a singular theorist. This chapter had three theorists. So first up, we have Julian Rotter, who was the youngest of three boys in a Jewish immigrant family. And Rotter and his family actually lived through the Great Depression. And, Rotter, on top of, this, he also faced a lot of discrimination in his life as a child and in his career for being Jewish. So all of this kind of made Rotter, fixate on things like social injustices and behavior. Um, Next up, we have Marvin Zuckerman, who I couldn't find much personal information on him. Um, so I do know that he did begin conducting his research on sensation seeking in the 1970s at the University of Delaware. So yeah, there is that. And then next up, we have Martin E.P. Seligman, who was born in Albany, New York. And sadly for Seligman, his father suffered a stroke when Seligman was only 13, and his father was physically disabled after that. And Seligman had a lot of challenges in life, helping his father with that as he grew up. Um, the gentleman who's smoking the pipe here on this page is Julian Rotter. Okay, moving on. So first up, we have Julian Rotter and his theory of the locus of control. And this is super, super simple, guys. So Rotter found through his research that some people believe that rewards and punishments depended on their own actions, and others believe that these things were completely out of their control and was dependent on outside forces. So, for an example, someone with an external locus of control, they're more likely to believe in things like luck or fate and that they are powerless, because whatever is going to happen in their life is going to happen, regardless of what they do. And these people with external locuses of control, they see little reason to exert extra effort in most situations. But on the opposite side of the spectrum, someone with an internal locus of control believes that everything is determined by their actions and that they are in control of most of their outcomes in life. People with an internal locus of control typically show more effort and they're better at overcoming adversity. And then some other, traits of the two, somebody with an internal locus, it will be proactive and optimistic and, they believe that what they do matters. But someone with an external locus of control, they believe that everything is already kind of predetermined. So why should you give extra effort? So super simple concept. So with the development of personality on this theory, it is heavily dependent on childhood and parenting. So people who have neglectful parents, abusive parents, or an unstable home life are more likely to develop an external locus of control. You know what I mean? Because it's kind of the way they're conditioned. And as a result of that, as this person gets older, they struggle with their physical and mental health. Oppositely, um, people with an internal locus of control usually go on to have much more fulfilling lives. And this is a result of things like authoritative parenting, or caring parenting. And, they the parents and the way they raise their child plays a huge role on what kind of locus gets developed. But there is some good news. As we age and as we get older, uh, it's been found that our internal locus of control will tend to increase. So, somebody can live just a really bad life and they can have an external locus of control, but as they get older, it's been found that more people kind of come to peace with the things, and they kind of develop a sense of control, and this aids, their internal locus, which in turn grows a little bit. And then we have this picture on the side. This is kind of a really good example of this theory overall. Internal locus of control, you make things happen, and then the external locus of control, things happen to you. So, what's your view on that? So next up, we have Marvin Zuckerman and his theory of sensation seeking. Sensation seeking is more of a personality trait than a theory, but it was still very prominent in the chapter. So sensation seeking is basically a desire for new experiences and feelings that are intense and complex. And there's a large range with this. So there are four different types of sensation seeking, and these include thrill and adventure seeking. Think adrenaline junkies, think skydiving. We have experience seeking, which is like, wanting to take a trip to the Bahamas or go somewhere you've never been, or, gather your friends and just do something you've never done before. And then you have disinhibition, which disinhibition is sensation seeking through risky behaviors, drugs, alcohol, unprotected sex, these kinds of things. Just think super risky behavior. And then you have boredom susceptibility. And boredom susceptibility is essentially when you are so scared to fall into a routine, so you do things to kind of get out of that. And there is good and bad sensation seeking. So obviously things like disinhibition would fall under bad sensation seeking. Thrill and adventure seeking could fall under bad sensation seeking if, it's harmful. And then, usually when these behaviors are productive, they're considered good sensation seeking. So there is a fine line there. So according to Zuckerman and, the development of personality through this theory, a child's development of sensation seeking is based on three things. It's their caretaker's behavior, their biology, and hereditary factors. So yes, the behavior and the observational learning of your parents is a part of this, but more so, Zuckerman believed more in biology, and he believed that, it was biological factors and hereditary traits that played more of a role in what type of sensation seeker you would be. So, didn't include that there, but I thought I would add it now. So yeah, behavior was a part, but it's nowhere near as big as your biology, at least according to Zuckerman. Okay, and next up we have Martin E.P. Seligman and his theory of personality of learned helplessness. So to Seligman, learned helplessness is when a person develops a sense of powerlessness and hopelessness, resulting in them believing they have no impact on their outcomes. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, isn't that just an external locus? And they're very, very similar, but they're not the same thing. Um, an external locus is more of a belief in outside forces, like luck and fate. And then learned helplessness is a condition of feeling powerlessness and not trying to escape, a bad situation. So that's the main difference between them. I know when some people think of an external locus and it's easy to get the two mixed up, but, feeling powerless in terms of an external locus is, just believing that everything is predetermined, but then learned helplessness is being in a bad situation and believing that you can't get out of it. People with an external locus don't necessarily live bad lives and they're not necessarily in a bad situation. They just kind of have a bad outlook on life. People who are suffering from learned helplessness are actually in, pretty bad situations, but they make no attempt to get out of it. So for the development of learned helplessness, this is actually pretty interesting. So learned helplessness can be developed through poor parenting and social observational learning. So when I say poor parenting, I'm thinking more of like abusive parents, and they kind of, the abuse was so extreme that even as the child gets older, they never really have a desire to leave the situation. They instead just kind of sit there and they just kind of take it. And then this goes on to affect their relationships as adults because they tend to get in abusive relationships. And I'm sure we've all seen, somebody in a abusive relationship and you think, oh, well, why don't they leave that person? Why do they put up with all that? And it's because of the development of learned helplessness. So usually if somebody is going to get stuck in a situation of learned helplessness, it it's developed a lot earlier in life, which is why poor parenting, I say, is kind of why, because people kind of seek familiarity. So they put themselves in a bad situation and then they have no desire to get out of it. And then, it's also learned, it can be learned when you're older through social observational learning. And they actually ran an experiment with this where they played annoying noises and some people had buttons to stop it and then some people didn't have buttons. And then the people whose buttons didn't stop the noise, they, after time, just kind of accepted their fate. That they stopped looking for new ways to stop the noise and they just kind of accepted it. So it's very interesting. So when it comes to our questions on human nature, free will or determinism, Rotter was definitely mixed, and that's deservingly so given his theory. Because if you have an internal locus of control, you believe more in free will, and if you have an external locus of control, you believe more in determinism. So Rotter definitely played with these in regards to his theory. Nature or nurture, nurture. Definitely was more dependent on childhood. Dependent or independent of childhood. Dependent, of course. Uniqueness or universality. I think Rotter believed we were all sort of unique in the way our locus was developed. Satisfaction or growth. This theory focuses more on satisfaction and optimism or pessimism. I'm going to say Rotter was more of an optimist. So moving on to Zuckerman. When it came to free will or determinism, he believed more in determinism. Um, Nature or nurture, he believed more in nature because he was big on biological factors. Dependent or independent of childhood, it was independent because, you know, biology, bi biological factors again. Uniqueness or universality, this is universality because sensation seeking, according to him, was a universal hereditary trait. Satisfaction or growth, satisfaction, of course, and then optimism or pessimism. This one I put mixed because reading about Zuckerman, he would say things that were pessimistic, but then he would also say things that were optimistic, and then he would say pessimistic things in an optimistic way, like he had kind of hope for people. So I just put mixed here. And lastly, for Seligman, when it came to free will or determinism, Seligman did believe in free will. For nature or nurture, Seligman was big on environmental factors, so nurture. Dependent or independent of childhood, dependent. Uniqueness or universality, unique. Satisfaction or growth, definitely growth. And optimism or pessimism, I want to say optimistic, but I put mixed here because even though he was hopeful people who were suffering from learned helplessness, he was also very pessimistic that some people couldn't get out of it. So for personality assessment, in terms of locus of control, Rotter developed self-report inventories to assess a person's locus of control. So he developed the internal, external, or the IE scale that consisted of 23 sections with 2 choices in each. So depending on how you answered each section, it was internal or external. So very simple. Zuckerman and his personality assessment on sensation seeking. Zuckerman actually measured just how potent a person's sensation seeking was with the sensation seeking scale, or the SSS. And this was actually a 40-item questionnaire. So an interesting thing to note about this is it is currently in its 5th version, and it's been revised multiple times, revised or enhanced. So lastly, Seligman didn't really have an assessment on learned helplessness, but he actually was the president of the APA, I believe, in the late 90s, and he thought psychology should deal with human growth. So he kind of coined these terms for positive psychology. And first we have positive emotion, which is satisfaction, contentment, or joy being linked to your well-being. This is just, being confident. We have engagement, and this is when a person, has commitment and absorption in life, meaning they're fully devoted to their goals in life, and these can be goals of, wanting to be a good mother or wanting to do well at your job, and you kind of you commit a lot of time to your goals, but you have fun doing it. And then meaning. And meaning involves using your talents, abilities, and strengths to serve a purpose larger than yourself. And this is typically religion or cause. And these are the 3 types of happiness, according to Seligman. And if you have all 3 of them, then yeah, you're really happy. Yeah. So as I close up and reflect, locus of control has contributed to helping and predict a person's mental and physical health, as well as advancing cognitive behavioral therapy. A limitation of locus of control theory, however, is just how simple it is. It does tend to overgeneralize. Sensation seeking has contributed to risk-taking and addiction research because there usually is a strong link between the two. Think disinhibition. However, limitations of sensation seeking include a tendency to focus more on negative traits, and then it's very difficult to measure in everyday life. And then learned helplessness, as we reflect on that, it's been used to aid and understand things like depression and anxiety, and it's aided in the development of treatment for depression and anxiety. And it's also helped bolster therapeutic strategies for increasing mental health. However, a limitation of discovery, the discovery or the theory of learned helplessness would be its failure to account for things like emotional or cultural factors. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for watching. I know this was a little bit longer, but sorry about that. I hope everybody passes the course, all their courses, and if I can make a recommendation, probably watch this in double speed. So thank you. Bye.